Welcome to Coffee with Cornelius. We're talking about integralism. What is integralism? Integralism is a political philosophy. It posits that religion should be the basis of law and public policy. It rejects the liberal post-Enlightenment consensus that the church should be confined to a separate sphere. Integralists are largely Catholic and believe that Catholicism should be the preferred religion of government. What does this really mean in practice? Is integralism just a dog whistle for fascism or racism or anti-Semitism? To help me through this, I am joined by Nathan Pinkoski. So Nathan and I know each other fairly well. He is from Alberta and received his BA from the University of Alberta and his MPhil and DPhil in politics from the University of Oxford, specializing in political philosophy. Since then, he has been a James Madison Fellow at Princeton University and is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Toronto. His popular writings include appearances in First Things, the Claremont Review of Books, the Federalist, and the Washington Examiner, among others. And Nathan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on. So this discussion can get technical, okay? So let's start with tangibles. Briefly, what is integralism? And what is liberalism? Because, you know, these terms get confused in our minds, right? Integral, liberal, what does it mean?
Sure. So that's a great thing to get us started here. I think two things to bear in mind before I leap into definitions. One is let's try to get a short conceptual definition, but let's also try to remember the specific historical context that gives rise to these camps, what specifically they rise in opposition to, because I think that helps us understand a little bit of the controversy that goes on in these discussions. So with integralism, conceptual definition. So this is from the website, the Josias, that publishes a lot of integralist Catholic thought and debates about it. They have 3 points for it. First is that integralism is a tradition of thought that rejects the liberal separation of politics from the concern with the end of human life, holding that political rule must order man to his final goal. Second, they say that man has both a temporal and eternal end. Integralism holds that there are two powers that rule him, a temporal power and a spiritual power. And third is, they say that man's temporal end is subordinated to his eternal end. The temporal power must be subordinated to this spiritual power. And now let's just note here that right in the very first point, we allude to a historical context, right? The rejection of the liberal separation of politics from concern with the end of human life. That's the context of the French Revolution. So integralism only emerges as a political theological position after the French Revolution. That's why we see so much of it is wrapped up with discussions.
So the rejection of the idea that life ends after death. How does that apply to politics, right? Isn't that just my personal belief? If you're a liberal, yeah, I guess, right, it would be, but not if you're an integralist.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I think it's really important to be clear from the start that we're talking from a theological perspective, right? We are talking about certain views about the cosmos and views that come through revealed theology, and particularly come through Catholic revealed theology. That's why I don't think we can get very far if we just set that aside. One thing also to note here, by the way, is even though we're discussing and starting from theology, we're not necessarily talking about a particular kind of political regime. You know, we could be talking about a monarchy, but we could also be talking about Christian democracy. It's not clear. So there's a lot of different ways we could go with that question. But I think the important thing here is the theological commitments are right from the get-go very important. So maybe now let's move to the definition of liberalism. And this is, I think, actually more complicated. This is the very issue, I think, in public life right now, is no one knows anymore what liberalism means, and they use it in very different ways, even in the same debate. And here, I think what can help us get some clarity is just by keeping in mind what I was saying about the historical context, what the opposition or the polemical target of these definitions. And I have three, I think, that are worth, three ways of thinking about this that are worth bearing in mind. So we could define liberalism as the freedom from unjustified coercion. We could say that the standard to adjudicate what qualifies as unjustified coercion is, say, natural rights. So this might be natural rights liberalism or classical liberalism. And this definition would oppose throne and altar arrangements. It would oppose socialism. It would oppose totalitarianism, we see that, there are times in the last 50 years where some of those definitions have been brought into public debate to say, go after totalitarians or go after socialists, right?
Can you just
Sure.
tell my listeners, what do you mean by natural rights? What does this concept mean?
So here I'm thinking of something like the US Constitution. The Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution are both discussing a certain series of natural rights that they think that people are owed, and you go into government, you form a government in order to secure those rights. And if the government isn't securing those rights, well, then you have a right to revolution. That's the point of the Declaration of Independence. So that's what's going on in that kind of definition.
So freedom from unjustified coercion seems like a good thing.
Yeah,
well, yeah,
exactly. But it's all, the devil's in the details, right? It's all about what we label to be unjustified.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the issue, I think, in what we might call a left liberal critique of that definition, which thinks that we don't really get a very robust state. We can't really achieve equality if we're too focused on that side of things. And then we might want to define liberalism in the second way, that it's about an expansive moral commitment to liberty or equality. And here, I think what really gets focused on is a commitment to individual autonomy. This is part of what John Rawls proposed. And here we're talking about moral reform to achieve that ideal of individual autonomy. So this is now a much more expansive view. And I think the opposition is partly to that first definition. It thinks that first account, natural rights liberalism, is too, it doesn't get us the sorts of moral commitments that we want, doesn't do enough in terms of discussing what we can use government power for.
There seems to be a bit of a contradiction here, and I'll explain what I mean by this. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, in a sense, they evoke natural rights based on the idea that we are all God-made, we are all created in the image of God, and therefore we are imbued from our Creator with natural rights. This is not really something that integralists would oppose, though, is it? The premise is pretty much the same.
Yeah, it's a good point. I would think that we have to look carefully at the language of the Declaration. The language of the Declaration is discussing us having certain rights endowed by our Creator. So it's not clear about the level of revealed theology we have to commit to, right? We could be Enlightenment deists and agree to that. And it's also unclear.
We could be Hindu, right? We could be
Hindu.
Yeah,
exactly.
There's no Catholic specificity in the Constitution.
Yeah, it's a very broad account, and it's really what it's trying to draw attention to is the fact that human beings are endowed by nature with certain rights, and that's what the job of government is. So there's a compatibility here, but there's also a lot of room for debate and a lot of room for disagreement, I think.
So how would integralism work in practice? And this is something that frustrates me about integralism, because I've read a fair amount from integralist scholars like Patrick J. Deneen, Adrian Vermeule at Harvard, and Gladden Papin at Texas. But it's all very much up in the air, airy-fairy. I don't get a clear, concrete sense of what this would look like in practice. Like, should we just abolish the Senate in Canada and put in place Catholic priests and clerics? Like, what would this look like?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the principal criticisms that one can make of a lot of these discussions about integralism. I'll take to answer this, I'll take a somewhat unorthodox view, I think, and push it in a different way. Because I think a lot of the difficulties is that we have people who are very familiar with American institutions, but they're not that familiar with other kinds of institutions. So if we remember just the first point of the Josias definition, that it's all about the rejection of the liberal separation of politics from concern with the end of human life. If we look into the Canadian political scene, we see things like state-funded religious schools defended as part of the constitutional arrangement, right? Going back to Confederation. We have a reference to God in the Charter, right? We have crosses in state buildings, right?
Well, there's no explicit separation of church and state in Canada, right? Yeah.
But yeah, exactly. And I think that Americans who are schooled in the kind of the vast understanding of the First Amendment, the way it's expanded very rapidly over the past 50 years, away from what it was originally intended to be, they're focused on a lot of these details. They think that if we just allowed for state funding some religious schools, if we made more references to God in either constitutional documents or in institutions, we'd end up with a better polity. And I think perhaps they're unaware and say that Canada faces a lot of the same problems that they're concerned about, the cultural, social problems, in spite of having all those institutions. But on the other hand, we could say that maybe this is part of this is a part of the proposals that are less controversial about things that integralists make. It's not always about a throne and altar regime. Canada, in a way, is an experiment in Christian democracy right from the Dominion. How could Catholics and Protestants coexist within the same polity? And the decision was made to support things like state-funded religious schools, to allow for a very generous model of federalism in order that the Catholics in Quebec could arrange their state in one way and have crosses in state buildings, and those who were in Ontario or in the West didn't have to do that if they weren't in an area with a Catholic majority. So more discussion, I think, like these, more discussion of particular political arrangements helps us see that a lot of integralist concerns perhaps are very central to American debates, and aren't necessarily discussing or referring to or familiar with other countries that have a much more fluid dynamic between church and state.
So hang on, you're not suggesting that Canada is more of an integralist model than the United States, are you?
Well, I'm saying that according to some of the ways that integralists write about this, yes.
Okay.
Because there are things like state-funded religious schools, which according to the First Amendment, at least the way it's been interpreted, isn't supposed to happen. And the point here, what I'm just trying to say, to repeat, is the American debates are very focused and insular to the American context, and a little expansion of their point of view, a little looking at other political regimes might draw attention to some of the arrangements that exist elsewhere. And I think critics of integralism could learn from that and say, say, well, I guess the proposals aren't necessarily that controversial. But also supporters could look at it and think, well, if Canada is still facing the same social problems that America faces.
That's right, exactly, yeah. Even worse.
Maybe we should think about something more than just the political
Yeah.
arrangement. Maybe there are other issues at stake.
That's fantastic. So let me ask you, what is integralism's critique of liberalism, essentially?
Yeah, so I think the basic point, the big point, is that liberalism sets up obstacles to both man's temporal end, it's not good at achieving the common good, and it sets up obstacles to man's spiritual end. It makes it harder for us to be either good Christians or good Catholics. It makes it harder for us to learn those sorts of virtues that would achieve our spiritual end. Now, there's more when we jump into the details. I think you mentioned Patrick Deneen's work, and if we go back to the two ways that I defined liberalism earlier, Deneen is attacking the first way, the kind of classical liberal natural rights approach, because he's saying it has the second, the Rawlsian autonomy, the moral reform, the obsession with moral reform, baked into it all along. So that's his claim, that if you start off with something like natural rights liberalism, you're going to get Rawlsian liberalism. It just takes a few hundred years, but you're still going to get it. There's another camp, though, that is more insistent on saying that the former classical rights liberalism is defenseless against the development of the latter, of the Rawlsian autonomy. So there's two ways to think about it. One's more radical, that's definitely Deneen. The latter is more subtle. It's books like David Schindler's book on the ambiguity in the thought of John Locke. But you could still end up with similar conclusions.
What ways of thinking, what modes of acting in our liberal Canadian society or our liberal American society make me less likely to tend towards the common good or tend towards God, for example?
Well, let's just take the example of religious schools.
Okay.
If the state says that it is unconstitutional for taxpayer money to go toward a religious school, chances are less people are going to be educated in religious school. Less children of, say, Catholic parents are going to have the opportunity for religious education. And moreover, we can see that if we have a very expansive understanding of that separation between church and state, where we say something like state money can never even be used indirectly to help out religious schools, then we have strongly secular schools which are pricing out strongly Catholic schools, right?
Right.
So in this situation, we're making it much more difficult for one to be educated in a particular religious tradition. So these are some of the, I think, the real world concerns that go on.
And what you talk about speaks to this way of thinking in liberalism, which is very much a market-oriented mindset, right? Which might actually go against some Catholic ways of thinking about society, right? Catholic social doctrine, for example, is not just about the market. It's about higher ends than the market. I'd like to skip ahead a little bit. I was going to ask this a bit later, but we're talking about Catholicism. We're talking about Catholics a lot. Why does integralism, or why does the religion that predates and presumes and forms the state under integralism, why does that have to be Catholicism? Why can't it be Orthodox Christianity, right? Why can't we resume the Byzantine Empire? Why can't we, retake Constantinople? Or why can't we have Islam? Why can't we have a caliphate or a Hindu Raj, for example, right? Why can't we have these? Like, what specifically is it about Catholicism that draws integralists toward Catholicism? After all, if you are a Kantian, everything is fundamentally about morals, right? So it doesn't matter what religion you have, you're going to end up at the same place, right? Towards the common good and achieving towards some sense of morality too. So why does it have to be Catholicism?
Right. So I think this goes back to the point about the importance of revealed theology. These are Catholics. Okay. These are essentially a large part of it, maybe not essentially.
Right.
They're debates internal to Catholic political thought. So if you accept what the church has taught and pronounced to be true, then you're going to want the political order to reflect that. But that said, I think there's two interesting observations to note that proceed from that. One is that there certainly isn't an attitude toward a kind of imperial desire to conquer all other political orders. It would recognize that an order in which you have the predominantly Muslim citizens isn't necessarily going to be one, isn't at all going to be one ready for a Catholic state. It would make no sense to try to operate a Catholic state there. So it ends up with a much more withdrawn mode of organizing political societies, right? You just focus on Christendom. What goes on in the other part of the world, that's not something that concerns Christendom. That's just one point. But the other point, what you say about the common good, I think is very important in these discussions, because one of the prominent strands that emerged from a lot of these early counter-revolutionary integralist criticisms of the French Revolution was a point that having any kind of religious order was actually more beneficial for the common good than having no religious order. So you've got this phenomenon of 19th century liberals or irreligious people arguing that religion was good for politics. So in this model, we would think that Islamic societies, the Byzantine Empire, societies arranged by Orthodox Christianity, even if they weren't necessarily Catholic societies or had no Catholicism, they were still better off at achieving the common good than were societies that abandoned that way of ordering entirely, that walked away from religion. And I think that's an important feature of 19th century thought worth paying attention to. And it also is an interesting departure from a lot of late 20th century liberal thought, which is often irreligious people scoffing at the thesis that religious practice leads to a better polity, whether it be an Islamic polity, whether it be a Hindu polity, whether it be Orthodox Christian polity. There's not a lot of serious study of how a more religious society might actually be better at achieving the common good. In 19th century liberal thought, you get people who write about that quite at length. Alexis de Tocqueville would be a great example. That's what he admires so much about America, is the capacity for its religious population to direct the morals of the United States in a healthy way.
I see. So let's turn to something a little bit more controversial. Okay. So James Patterson, you've written a response to James Patterson. That's part of the reason I'm having you on the show, because people like James Patterson have argued that integralism is essentially synonymous with fascism. So can you give us a little bit of a background about this claim? And is it true? Is it true? Is integralism just a dog whistle for fascism and racism?
Sure, I think it's a question worth taking seriously. And as what is perhaps clear in the discussion so far, a lot of the debate goes on, a lot of the controversial issues go on by debates, by reference to contemporary liberalism, what's going on in contemporary liberalism. And Patterson is someone who I admire in terms of his zeal for trying to defend the American Republican order. And I think that's what worries him, is he feels like the American Republican order is under attack, and he really wants to go to bat to defend it. But we shouldn't distort the historical record to do that. I mean, it is true that integralists sometimes allied with fascists or became fascists, but liberals, socialists, communists did that all as well, right? And we shouldn't recharacterize them as fascists. And I think what he makes three big mistakes that we have to address. Is first, he's playing really fast and loose with the integralist label, setting aside the theological components, which we've discussed are really important. And indeed, it only is intelligible from the theological points. And then he applies this integralist label to all kinds of movements where people refuse to discuss theology, like Action Française and Charles Maurras. Mm-hmm. The second mistake he makes is that he imagines unified integralist movements becoming fascist movements in the 1930s and 40s, when in fact we see integralist movements breaking down, falling apart in that time, and their adherents going off in a range of different directions, to the left, to the right, to the center, to Christian democracy. And third, this is I think one of the most distorting features of Patterson's account, because it actually calumnies real people. Because he's so determined to argue for an undeniable connection between integralism and fascism, he forgets that there are anti-fascists and anti-Nazis in the leadership of some of these integralist movements, and he casts those people into the dustbin of history, right? So he named the Carlist movement. The Carlist claimant to the throne, Don Javier, was someone who was not welcome in Franco's Spain. He enlisted in the Belgian army to fight the Nazis when they invaded in 1940. He later joined the French resistance and was sent to Dachau, right? He's such a fascist that he's sent to Dachau. And you can't say these things about the leadership of some of the movements. I think it's deeply unfair to what they actually did during the war. But the historical point is one that I think what we lose if we're just trying to lump integralists together with fascists is we lose the more interesting historical story of the mid-20th century, which would pose questions like, why do Christian Democrats, Christian socialists, and post-war traditionalists all share similar origins in the same movement, in the same integralist movement, for example? Why was it that integralism couldn't hold together in the 1930s and 40s? What does that say about the failure of a lot of these movements? And what is common between left and right critics of liberalism? What do these people hold in common that they may disagree with each other in terms of whether they want to restore the monarchy or whether they want a more radical democracy? But they still share some of the same tenets. If we just blur all these movements together, we lose the chance to actually explore some of these details. And just by way of comparison here, an important story of the 19th century is that a lot of the people who were legitimistes, who were counter-revolutionaries became socialists. I think there's a similar story to be told in the 20th century, people who were counter-revolutionaries becoming attracted by the political left. But we don't see that right now because we're too driven by our set of ideological blinders. And we're losing out a lot of the chance to discuss and acknowledge the interesting history of and what real people did during those times if we just come at it with a desire to taint everyone under the label of fascism.
So it sounds like Patterson's argument is an example of low-hanging cherry picking, but what would be some legitimate critiques of integralism? We talked already about how it's not, they don't seem to be really interested in practicalities. To me, it seems like a largely academic debate. But just from the academic point of view, just philosophically, what can you see as some problems with the integralist movement? And maybe theologically too, because it is a theologically grounded ideology.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to recap what I said earlier, I think the comparative political philosophy, the comparative political science, to be more precise, is important. Looking at regimes that, say, have an established church like the United Kingdom, studying those arrangements and see where they have succeeded or failed, or Canada, with what I described as the ecumenical experiment, looking at what the advantages and disadvantages of that approach are. I think this is working at a more abstract level now, but I think it's an important point to make, is a lot of these thinking start with a fully worked out theory and then try to impose that down on political practice. And there's an interesting book that Pierre Manon just published. The English title is Natural Law and Human Rights. And here I think that within this, there's a good point to be made against the integralists. This isn't his primary target, but it's just worth drawing up for our purposes. His concern is that we can't just start from a fully worked out metaphysical theory and go impose that on political practice. That's the subtitle of Manon's book, is Between Metaphysics and Politics in the French edition. That's what it was. And there's a lot of integralists who just seem to be doing this. They just seem to think we're going to have a fully worked out theory as to what the best political arrangement is, and we're ready to waltz into a political situation and impose it. Now, I think they realize that the best of them, at any rate, realize that this is an impossible project. So they're more interested in thinking about how to recover a certain way of understanding the world, a certain way of understanding politics that might become necessary in the future. So that's the project. But here, we should bear in mind that if we're not talking about concrete political proposals for now, the theory becomes, or the integralist project becomes more just about thinking or about the history of Catholic political thought and less about action. The other point I'd say is, and I'll just read a little passage from a wonderful article that Carlo Lancelotti published in the last edition of Communio magazine. He has a great paragraph where he gets to the heart of what some of the problems are. So just for our listeners, he's using the term Occidentalism here. Let's just think of that like liberalism for the purposes of what I'm about to say. So he writes, against the integralists, for example, there is little point in focusing on the relationship between temporal and spiritual powers, which so often preoccupies certain neo-integralist Catholic literature. Occidentalism does not stem from an incorrect understanding of the relationship between church and state, or more generally, of what we collectively owe to the truth and what we owe to personal freedom, which was at bottom the old liberal question. Occidentalism holds to an incorrect view of humanity, and its critique cannot be carried out merely at the political level, but involves a reenactment of the Socratic Platonic discovery of the soul. So the point here that Lancelotti makes is that if we just focus on political institutions or political arrangements, we forget that the real problem is about the theological anthropology, about what our understanding of the human being is, informed by theology. And that, if that's correct, that way of reading things, then it suggests that integralists at least take a step back and think much more carefully about their how their theological assumptions are presupposing a particular view of the human person. And that's indeed what Jacques Maritain was doing in his book, Integral Humanism, which is kind of the break from the more traditionalist, royalist account of integralism toward a more Christian democratic account. So there's a lot of room for integralists to think more carefully about these views, but I think that would mean they'd have to walk back a little bit from some of their focus and some of the priority on the getting the right relationship between church and state, or the narrow focus on the political level.
I see. So I'm very favorable to Burkean conservatism, right? I love Roger Scruton. Very sad his passing away.
Yeah.
And the premise behind Burkean conservatism, or at least one of the many premises, but one major premise, is that society is a contract. It's a contract between the living, the dead, and the unborn. So the living, that's us, the ones who are alive. We honor the memories of those who have died, and we honor their contributions to the society, and we attain to build upon that society for future generations, right? We have this contract, so we respect tradition. We don't just think that tradition is something to be cast away like a paper towel. We have a deep appreciation for it. And so it would seem that integralism would have a lot in common with conservatism. However, I was listening to an interview with Gladden Papin in which he essentially trashes Burkean conservatism. And he says that conservatives naively wish to conserve traditions without the appropriate application of power in order to do so. So what is the relationship between integralism and Burkean conservatisms?
Yeah, so that's it's a great question. I actually think this is one of the deep areas of real philosophical interest, but it would involve taking both sides seriously. I'll answer it by reference to a story that I have about Sir Roger Scruton. May he rest in peace. I didn't know him. I had one exchange with him. I'll tell you about that one exchange. He was giving a talk where he was defending Hobbes against Rousseau. And his point was that if you're a good Burkean or Scrutonian conservative, you don't take politics too seriously. Mm-hmm. Politics is necessary, but it shouldn't become too serious. And
that's right.
He liked Hobbes because Hobbes is not idealistic about the natural order. And he thinks that if you follow the path of Rousseau, you end up with politics getting too serious. So I said to him something like, I posed him a question, and I said to him something like, well, this discussion is too modern. Surely we might want to draw reference to some of the classical views, people like Aristotle, who took politics seriously but didn't fall into the kind of effectively the left-wing Jacobinism or totalitarianism that you're worried about, Sir Roger. And he looked at me and said, well, I'm sorry I could not refer to the totality of the Western tradition in my talk.
So is that to suggest that the integralists are more aware of that totality than the Burkean conservatives, or is it not?
I think that would be the best take I would give on Gladden Papin, that he's trying to draw attention to some aspects of classical political thought that some strands of contemporary Burkean conservatives have forgotten about or left alone. You know, one thing that's worth bearing in mind is that Burke is a defender of some kind of close relationship between church and state, defends the established church. And that's not what a lot of American Burkeans do. They just sort of pretend that Burke never wrote about that or posed that question.
But I don't think he does it in as strong a sense as the integralists would, right? I don't think he would argue that the church is before the state, and therefore the church should guide and mold the main actions of the state.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But he does have a defense of them being related, and that already is beyond the pale for a lot of people who want to criticize integralism or rethink the relationship between church and state. But that's a good point. A lot depends on how we reason to our political order. And the role we give to theological positions. But here, I think the real debate between Burkean conservatives and someone like Gladden Papin goes back to discussions that exists, say, with Strauss, with Leo Strauss and Burkean conservatism. Leo Strauss was a critic of Burkean conservatism from something like the natural rights view. He thought that Burkean conservatives didn't have a good account of eternal principles, of principles that persisted through time and weren't contingent on certain historical circumstances. If you think that there are eternal principles and you think that those should play some role in ordering the political community, then you're going to be much more insistent on the importance of politics, because you really need to make sure that those principles are established, that you get them right and that you apply them. If you don't think that, then you're going to end up with a view that thinks that politics is something you shouldn't get too caught up in. And that, I think, is one of the real almost perennial problems that exist in political thought. It's a debate between classical political philosophy and the importance it gives to politics, and modern political philosophy, which often, because of the abuse of those who took politics too seriously, think of the Jacobin movement, right? Think of the totalitarians, is much more interested in putting emphasis on not taking politics too seriously. So this is an old quarrel, I think, that is larger than just integralism.
So the integralists are very critical of liberalism. And another great man, great scholar, his book completely changed my way of thinking, After Virtue, Alasdair MacIntyre. Alasdair MacIntyre really, I think, in that book beautifully spells out the logical contradictions and even the practical contradictions within liberalism as a movement. So you have an article in First Things, and this is related to COVID-19, right? The pandemic. It's related to what we're going through right now. One of the ways that liberalism has manifested itself in our modern day world is one of those contradictions. It's the rule by experts, right? The rule by these self-anointed, or maybe anointed by the academy, experts who tell us what to do. Health experts, economic experts, foreign policy experts, people who might have a lot of knowledge, right, about a particular area, but quite often they use their expertise to seek rents and to essentially empower themselves. What's Alasdair MacIntyre's critique of experts, and how does it apply to COVID-19 specifically?
Yeah, so MacIntyre, who's not an integralist,
No,
but
he's not. Yeah.
is still a very insightful critic of liberalism. He was drawing attention to the rise of a managerial class. He's not the only one to do that, but the rise of managerialism in contemporary politics. And he wanted to draw attention to the sort of what the managers are really doing, what the managerial class is really doing. And he was argued that we have this image of kind of a corporate conspiracy or a bureaucratic conspiracy where they pull the strings for our life and they decide everything and control us like that. Against that popular image, he wanted to argue something different. So he was rejecting that, saying that view is false. Managers are not actually that good at social control and in their own organizations or beyond. But this is precisely the problem, because in the absence of them having the capacity to really do social control well, they have to engage in these sort of theatrical or performative measures to enforce their decisions. So it becomes less about their particular expertise, what they know, but more about how good they are in the performance to convince other people to do what they say. And MacIntyre's point was that modern politics just becomes this kind of contest for social control through performance, and this means less and less deliberation about the good, and more of these of this kind of theater. So the COVID-19 context for this, which I think has been borne out in a lot of places, is if we are saying something well-intentioned like trust the experts or try and enforce that, it doesn't actually mean listening to the technicians or listening to the researchers. It actually means just subscribing to a particular theatrical narrative, and
Right.
one that often conceals over a lot of the paradoxes. You wrote about this, I think, a few weeks ago. I saw, but
Yeah.
you have people who are saying, the government leaders who are saying, trust the experts, and they tell you one day that masks are useless, and the next day that they're absolutely necessary. Right? This isn't about listening to scientific facts. This is about either supply management, managing masks, right, or managing panic. So the problem is that around this pandemic is despite this rhetoric of trust the experts, we actually get situations where medical practitioners are not respected, actual researchers are not respected,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have media adjuncts who start distorting what researchers say. Researchers, I used the word technicians earlier, researchers, and scientific practitioners, they're in the business of intellectual humility and modesty. They're in the business of trying to offer particular claims about what is true, tailored to a very limited set of circumstances. And so they will go into discussions about whether certain drugs are ready for the market or not. And they're trying to make modest claims. But then you have media adjuncts who kind of leap into this with a narrative and they hyperbolize it, or make the discussion about something else entirely. There's a friend of mine, I won't say who, but he was interviewed recently by the Washington Post. And what he said was taken completely out of context and turned into a kind of alarmist hyperbole. And quotes were attributed to him that he didn't actually say. His point was a kind of a measured criticism about certain remarks about some drugs, whether they were ready for market or not. And he has media who are distorting what he's saying to make it sound much more alarmist and much more like a crisis situation than what he actually was. And that's exactly what seems to be happening in a lot of these situations. And I think McIntyre is a great source for identifying that, drawing attention to the theater involved in so much of this, and the abandonment of reasoning about what is good, and the abandonment of a capacity to offer modest, reasonable, limited claims in the public sphere. That's all thrown out in the name of the performance.
Yeah, and you know what? McIntyre is great. I can say and I can recommend, if anybody's watching this, they're an undergrad, read McIntyre. If I had read McIntyre when I was an undergrad, I would be in a much better place philosophically. Now, maybe Nathan, maybe you read McIntyre when you were an undergrad.
I was going to say you're a better man than I am, because the first time I read him, I didn't understand him at all. So I think it's important not only to read McIntyre, but to read him carefully and understand him.
Sure. Yeah.
The first time I read it, I did not get what was going on.
Well, to be fair, I'm not going to lie and say that I understand everything in McIntyre, but I think his critique of liberalism is something that we really need to think about, especially since much of our present day governmental system and laws and institutions are based on liberalism, right? And based on these ideas. So we're coming to the end now of our interview, but I'd like to ask you, Nathan, where can we find you online? Where can we follow your work? You don't have Twitter, I don't think, but do you have anything else that would enable us to help follow you?
Yeah, so I don't have Twitter. Maybe I will someday, but for now I don't. But I think what I encourage anyone who's interested in following up on some of the points that I've said here would be just to send me an email. I'm always delighted to hear from people who've read my articles and want to pose further questions, and I reply to everyone who sends me a note. So that email is nathan.pinkoski at utoronto.ca.
That's great. I mean, yeah, please continue.
Yeah, no, if there's a few people who can profit from that to follow up and want to learn more, and I'd be delighted to hear from them. So that's the best way to get a hold of me, and I'm always happy to share articles with those friends and those who want to.
And you write regularly, don't you? You write regularly for a few publications.
I tend to write for First Things most often. That would be the one that I have done the most for, I think, recently. Also, Law and Liberty. So yes, sporadically I write for those, and if anyone is interested in what I'm working on or wants to hear more about some ideas that I have on some of the subjects we've discussed, I can always respond to particular questions about that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nathan, for joining us. That was a fascinating conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Cheers. I'm going to stop recording now.